Well, my friends, it took us a while, but this is episode 100 of Theology Curator, also called the Paulcast. Here's the thing. I can't believe that I ever got to 100 episodes. In fact, I can't believe that I ever started a podcast. And now some of you have been here since the very beginning. You were initially drawn in because you listened to sermons of mine from back in the day, or you read my blog articles from back in the day, and you have this interest in the Apostle Paul. And I want to just say thank you so much. And even though we've expanded beyond just talking about Paul on this podcast, that is a central area, as you know, in my own sort of research and interests, and so it comes up quite often. But I wanted to say a few words now that we've been through 100 episodes together. You know, one of the things that I remember is thinking to myself, I'm doing research on Paul in grad school, and I like saying words, and saying words sometimes is easier than writing words. So why don't I just record things I'm thinking about and put it on the internet? Little did I know that it would gain traction like it has, and I just am so thrilled. In fact, I look back at the archives of those early episodes, and I'll tell you, the quality wasn't what I would call awesome. In fact, I would say, wow, what in the world was that introduction? And wow, I was using a random little microphone on my kitchen table trying to make this thing work. And yet you listened and you kept coming. And some of you maybe didn't start with that initial series called Entering the Conversation, but you came along eventually and found various things that you've gleaned from, such as ongoing conversation about the Apostle Paul within the context of scholarship, ministry, etc. Some of you have found a lot of help and insight from the various interviews I've gotten to do with scholars of Paul, and other things that have come up, like women in ministry, creation and evolution, eschatology, meaning the end times, and so many other issues pertaining to Paul and his Jewish background and what it looks like to lean into the ancient world of the first century dominated by a Roman Empire and the 21st century world of a different kind of empire, but empire nonetheless. And if any of that has been helpful for you over the last several years, I am so grateful. To all of you who are listening right now, I want to just let you know that as a token of my gratitude, I will be offering up 5 free copies of N.T. Wright's new book called Interpreting Paul, Essays on the Apostle and His Letters. I'm going to be offering that up to 5 different people who email me at info@theologycurator.com. And here's what I need you to confirm for me. Simply confirm that you have been to theologycurator.com/newsletter and have clicked the link and have signed up for my newsletter. And from there, you can go to all of the social media sites that you inhabit online. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and go and track me down and follow me. I'm easy to find. Your social media website of choice.com/Kurt Willems, KurtWillems. And once you've done that, zip that email on over to me, and I will let you know if you were one of the first 5 to submit your entry. That email address again is info@theologycurator.com. Again, I hope it's just a fun way to hook you up, and it's also a way to encourage folks to track with my journey online. It's kind of a win-win, right? So let me know. So that's the offer. Get Interpreting Paul by N.T. Wright by emailing me at info@theologycurator.com, saying yes to newsletter, yes to the social media sites, and I will hook up the first 5 of you with a copy of that book. Look, I'm really excited to step into this next season. We're at episode 100, and now, my friends, we are going to jump into today's content.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
I want to welcome you back to Theology Curator. My name is Kurt Willems. I'm the host of this show. Formerly, it was called the Paulcast, a podcast all about the Apostle Paul, but we've just expanded beyond only focusing on Paul, although you're going to get quite a bit of Paul content, I assume, as you listen in. My friends, here we are. We are in 2020. We've had a pandemic. We've had protests. We've had lots to hold. We have a presidential election coming up. I mean, we have so many things to consider. And what has happened since we were in a topic that's really important, in my opinion? We were in a topic last year called the Bible. And I've always talked about this being an ongoing sort of series. And last fall, we started, and part 1, 2, 3, and 4 were posted both to my newsletter community as well as my podcast here. And if you want to go back, you can track down the Bible series by going to theologycurator.com/podcast, and you can probably track it down there, or you can just scroll in your feed because you'll find it there really easily. Well, here's the thing. I had hoped to come back to this series. We took a break last November, and my goal was to actually come back to this series in the winter, spring of 2020. Well, we all know what happened. COVID, stay-at-home orders, pandemic. And, here's the thing. If you're anything like me, many things shifted in your life when the pandemic hit. If you are someone who works from home, especially, maybe you get this. But for my part, my full-time work hours really quickly turned into half days that I split with my wife in some sense. We have 2 kiddos, so we had to come up with a plan to get us all the way to the summer. And it wasn't easy, but we figured out a rhythm that worked. And between trying to make sure that I wasn't neglecting ministry work, I was also writing my first book, a book on Jesus and suffering and hope. And, trying to really just be present to my family. Of course, the newsletter and the podcast have had to slow down. And you know what? To be honest with you, that may be the case for some time. I don't know how consistent I'll be able to be, but I'm going to try my best to continue to deliver excellent content. And here's the thing. Beyond this series on the Bible, we, of course, have had multiple interviews that have been posting. There's many more to come. Right now, at the time of recording, I think I have 6 interviews that are being edited and are going to be part of the flow here during the fall. So I'm really excited to share a lot of those with you. So here's the deal. I find myself with some time and some motivation to put together a few more posts and a few more podcasts in this series. So, again, it doesn't have an end in sight. I just want to have a ongoing way to talk about the Bible. So I'm creating them in advance, and hopefully you'll have a few of them flow into your inbox in the upcoming weeks. And by the way, if you do not get the inbox thing happening from me, all you got to do is go to theologycurator.com/newsletter. That's theologycurator.com/newsletter. And you'll see a link there to go to my subscription page for the newsletter. And you'll be able to actually get written versions of these episodes, as well as all of the other things that I send out. And it'll also link to the various episodes of this particular series. So hopefully that all makes sense. But here's the deal. I want to jump into the Bible. And we are in part 5. I've called this The Movement Continues. And what I want to do is really sort of catch us up a little bit. I can't catch us up thoroughly, but I will catch us up a little bit to talk about what I've been doing. And basically, we've been tracing a flow of events. Everything that starts with Jesus to Jesus's movement to the New Testament documents that are crafted and eventually a compiled Bible. And the reason we're doing this is just trying to frame what the Bible is before we start talking specifically about various texts, various theological issues, etc. We need to just talk about what the Bible is historically speaking and how it eventually moves to canonization. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about canonization per se, but I just want to make sure we have a big bird's eye view of what happens from Jesus to Constantine, essentially, when we eventually get a compiled Bible. So the early church was driven by the Jesus event. And the Jesus event, we've said, is his life, teachings, death, resurrection. And probably the resurrection from a historical perspective is the most important, along with like appearances and his ascension. And of course, we believe that his event is two-staged, that there's a future return that we'll talk about, I'm sure, a lot in other episodes. Then after the Jesus event, we talked about the second thing, Jesus movement, the ongoing gathering of communities committed to worshiping the triune God and living in the power of God's Spirit to represent God's kingdom or party. I know some people don't love the kingdom analogy or just don't resonate with it. So we could talk about party or various other ways we might talk about the values of the kingdom of God, coming to bear among us without necessarily needing kingship language. I tend to stick with it just because I think it's helpful for understanding the Bible particularly. And so I can go off on that. But if kingdom's not your favorite word, think of party or movement. And so we've got Jesus event, Jesus movement. And then we have the third thing we've talked about, the Jesus documents, which of course we mean New Testament documents, right? So trying to be completely Jesus-y, I guess, here. So various documents were organized and recognized in various ways as Holy Scripture, but they weren't systematically organized initially throughout all the churches. And we've asked, why did the movement keep going if it's not based on a Bible? Well, again, it's rooted in the Jesus event, which catalyzed the Jesus movement, which leads to these documents, which leads to number 4 here, compiled Bible, or maybe, I don't know if I want to keep my Jesus thing going, the Jesus book, right? The compiled Bible. This is finally put together in the 4th century in continuity with what all the churches that were sort of in the same Orthodox stream of understanding and in historical continuity to the Jesus event. These are books that were basically affirmed throughout the communities, even if they didn't all have every copy, not all of them had 27 documents yet at this point, but they were moving towards that. And so Jesus event, Jesus movement, Jesus documents, which leads finally to Jesus book, the Hebrew scriptures, along with our 27 documents in the New Testament. The early church was driven by this event. The early church was driven by this movement. The early church produced these documents, and the early church eventually gave birth to a Jesus book. And here's the thing, the Jesus movement should have been snuffed out by years off and on again with persecution, as we'll talk about some more. But instead it keeps growing. And that's one of the things that is so compelling. It keeps going. And one of the main points of our early reflections on the Bible simply was this, that the Bible is not the point. It points to the point who is a person. Jesus is the point, and the event of his life, death, resurrection, and ascension launched a movement in the world. The resurrection specifically is the anchor point of the Jesus event that gave the movement courage and joy as they continue to tell others about God's love. The Bible is central, and I want to be very clear about this. The Bible is central to Christian faith without being the center of it. that place is reserved for Jesus alone. So as we noted last time we were on this topic several months back, placing Jesus at the center led early Jesus movement people to suffering and at times death. I want to continue talking about some of that suffering and death in the rest of this conversation. I want to share a quote with you that actually I heard from Andy Stanley, the pastor and preacher in Georgia, who had this great series that in some ways really sparked how I'm framing this initial part of our series called The Bible for Grown-Ups. I actually really liked a lot of what he did. There's little nuances here or there that I don't love, but overall, I really like the way he frames this historically, and he's borrowing from scholars. He's borrowing from Tom Wright, he's borrowing from Rodney Stark, I'd assume, and various others, right? So this is a quote that I first heard from him, and it is from Tertullian, who we know was alive from about 155 to 240 CE, Common Era, AD, for those of you who remember that. And this is what he says. If the Tiber floods the city, or if the Nile refuses to rise, or if the sky withholds its rain, if there is an earthquake, a famine, a pestilence, at once the cry is raised, Christians to the lions. End quote. As we looked at in part 4, the previous episode on this topic at least, the earliest Jesus followers committed themselves to Jesus and his movement, even until death. From the days of the apostles through 250 CE, the people of Jesus found themselves relatively, in times of relatively little persecution and pressure, and then really intense seasons of it. In the previous episode, and if you want to go to a visual form of this, you can see the previous post, part 4 of the Bible series at my newsletter, which all of those, by the way, are posted as almost like blogs. So you can kind of go back into the history, the archives of those. And you can see the timeline. But Tertullian really helps give us perspective within his own lifetime. Christians were often scapegoated. And this isn't news to anyone. You've heard a lot of stories. I mean, even the early stories of Nero, you may have heard. As Rome burns, he turns to this new kind of sect called Christians, and many of them end up being tortured and die. And here's the thing about the early Jesus followers. Their unwillingness to worship the gods of the empire left people suspicious of them. So it's legal in Judaism for Jews who are, part of Judaism at the time, of course. They had a legal status that actually allowed for this. They could worship their one God. And here's the thing. Over time, the lines continue to blur as to whether or not these Messiah followers qualified, I'm using air quotes, qualified as Jews in the eyes of Rome, in the eyes of the law. And that was really significant because these Jewish people early on just had built into their arrangement with Rome that they would worship just their God, but that they would do things like offer an offering and prayer for the emperor on an annual basis. It's kind of I don't know. I think it's a big compromise, but many of them also probably thought it was a compromise, but it was like, yeah, I can understand why they came up with that solution. But they did not have to worship the imperial gods. But here's the thing. This became more and more tense depending on who was emperor as the decades and years, as it keeps moving forward. So one of the worst seasons of persecution came during the reign of Decius, who he only reigned for a couple of years, from 249 to 251 CE. He issued an edict calling for the worship of the non-Christian gods across the whole empire. This was probably the first real systematic empire-wide attempt to suppress Christianity. Up to this point, really it was a lot of local stuff like in Rome or in Asia Minor or wherever it might be, but it was never this sort of all of the empire type of deal until up to this point, at least based on the historical evidence. So in January of 250, orders came that customary annual sacrifices in Rome to Jupiter, the god Jupiter, who is basically Zeus, by the way, and the other imperial gods must be observed everywhere. While this wasn't specifically directed at Christians per se, it directly affected them uniquely. Either they accommodate or risk execution. Decius had a plan too. He didn't just sort of say, okay, go do that now, but there's actually a way to make sure that people were carrying out these orders. And so Decius had a whole system, a very rigid system, with these documents called libelli. Libelli is how we spell it in English. And people were required, if they were stopped by the authorities, to actually prove that they had participated in the Greco-Roman sacrifices. Think about that. I mean, a modern day parallel would be something like undocumented persons in the United States who in various contexts may be asked about their papers, their identification, right? So the kind of pressure that you would imagine that folks in modern day have as undocumented persons in this country that I happen to live in. I know some of you don't live here, but you know what's going on. I mean, you've heard the border stories. You've heard about the terrible, terrible treatment we've had of people trying to find refuge here. I mean, you know the stories. Imagine that kind of pressure, but also, of course, at the risk of death, I guess, like actual execution. That was the deal. And libelli were actually something that people had to provide. I actually have copies of one of these. Well, not like in my hand, but I have pictures. You can't see these pictures, but I want to just read a bit of it to you because I think it's really interesting. Check this out. I have a copy here that I'll read. It says, "To those chosen to superintend the sacrifices in the village of Alexander's Island from Aurelius Diogenes," sorry, I'm going to say these names fast and terribly, "son of Sabatus of the village of Alexander's Island, aged 72, with a scar on his right eyebrow. I have always sacrificed to the gods, and now in your presence, in accordance with the terms of the imperial edict, I have sacrificed and poured a libation and have tasted the sacrificial victims." And these are all, by the way, pause. These are all sorts of practices, right? And this quote, by the way, has a few editorial inclusions, but you can see that on the website if you want to see the differences. And it continues. He says, "I request you to certify this. Farewell, I, Aurelius, have presented this petition." Okay, so notice the very clear way this person is actually writing. He has someone who has to stamp it with approval and has to give a lot of details so that it's clear that this happened. There's a second hand who then signs it. "I, Aurelius Syrus, saw you and your son sacrificing." And then a third hand writes, "I," and it's kind of messed up manuscript, so it just says, "I, son of someone, certify it." And then back to the first writer. "In the first year of the emperor Caesar Gaius Messius Quintus Traianius Decius," it's Decius, "Pixus," it keeps going, "Felix Augustus on Epiph 2 or second." In other words, this happened on June 26th, and this was in 250 CE. Okay, lots of words. I'm stumbling over them, but hopefully you get the idea. This is a really crazy thing. And so we come back to a main point in the series so far. We've said, why the Bible? Because something compelling happened. Something compelling happened. It was so compelling that even in these situations, most of the Jesus followers were committed even unto death. And of course, by this time, the members of the Jesus movement were rooted in the Jewish scriptures and the New Testament documents. I mean, they have greater access by 250, there's no doubt. However, these scriptures, as I've said earlier, they weren't readily available in a completed package. So the stories they knew either orally or through their local leaders who, you can assume had copies of these scriptures. They were propelled to faithfulness because of the Jesus event and the stories of the scriptures. So although Decius wasn't in power long, his actions led to immense suffering. And you can imagine, what do? Do I compromise? Do I make sure my papers are signed? Do I forge papers? What do I do? But here's the deal. They did not suffer for a book, although the things that we have in the Bible were inspiring to them. They suffered to be faithful to the one they had been told for the last several generations was Jesus, a person, not a book, who had raised from the dead. That, my friends, should be compelling as we continue in this series, as hopefully you catch up if you need to go back to read part 1 through 4 or listen to part 1 through 4. I really hope that you'll continue on this journey because it's so important that we understand that the situation for these early Jesus followers was we've got to be faithful. The stories that we have heard about Jesus implore us to faithfulness, that new creation has been born in the world, that suffering only lasts for a moment, that God is making all things new, that even when the tyrants of the world try to suppress who we are, try to make us feel as though our movement is invalid, there is a God who looks like Jesus, who continues to propel us into mission, into love, and into, historically speaking, radical expansion of this group. Well, my friends, I hope that was helpful. And here's the deal. We're going to come back to this theme in the next episode. That'll be part 6 of the series. And once we've gotten through part 6, a new sort of section will emerge where we start talking about the Bible itself a little bit more. So we'll move from history to understanding what is the ancient book we call the Bible actually trying to do. Until then, my friends, or until the next interview or other episode that may come in between this conversation and the next one on the Bible, I hope you have a great day, a great week. I pray for your safety, your health, and I pray that this pandemic can end sooner than later and that we as Jesus people will be known for our common humanity and love towards our neighbors from here and beyond. Go in peace, my friends.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.